I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I am the director of the University of New Hampshire School of Law's Social Justice Institute. And we, along with the Whittemore Business School at UNH and Concord Coalition, have put this event together. And I just wanted to first thank you all for being here. It's great to see so many distinguished members of the New Hampshire community in the building, as well as our students here today. And I did want to acknowledge Congressman Paul Hodes, who's here. It's great to see you. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dean Dan Ennis from WSBE, who's going to introduce our speaker, Mark Zandi, and then that will be followed by Bob Bixby from the Concord Coalition, and then we're going to open it up for question and answers, and hopefully we can have a conversation with our two speakers at the end. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dan Ennis.
Thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today, and I want to extend my welcome on behalf of the Whittemore School of Business and Economics at UNH. It's great to be here at the law school, and we're talking about some important issues that really are interdisciplinary and should concern all of us. And the business school and the law school got together several months ago with the help of the Concord Coalition and decided that we needed to hold a series of forums looking at some of the major issues facing the next generation. So we launched this thing called Next Generation Matters, and the idea is to have some conversations about the major issues that are facing all of us. We've invited the presidential candidates to come to talk with us. So far, we don't have any scheduled, but as things get tighter and closer, I expect we'll probably get some positive responses, and we look forward to welcoming them here and also in Durham as we go through the next month or month and a half. We didn't want to wait any longer before getting started, though, in talking about these issues, and we didn't want to wait for the candidates. We're facing a really interesting time in our history, and we have an economy that's growing slowly, we have a high rate of unemployment, and that has implications for everybody's future. Talking with our speakers just a little bit ago, I asked them, how will people feel when they leave? And I think you'll feel as though you've watched a very interesting movie. You'll walk out with different emotions. Some will be happy and upbeat and positive. Others will say, boy, this is tough, but I think we can do it. And others will say, I know we can do it. And I am of the view, I know we can do it. We as a nation always come through and always get it done. So let me introduce our first speaker, and that's Mark Zandi. And he is chief economist for Moody's Analytics and has been looking at all of this for a long time and will give us his perspective. He's going to be discussing, of course, the economic, political, legislative outlook for the coming year. He's been a trusted advisor to policymakers, an influential source of economic analysis for businesses, journalists, and the public. Testifies before Congress frequently on a wide range of topics dealing with fiscal issues, the economy, regulatory reform of the financial markets, and so on. He's a frequent guest on CNBC, NPR, CNN, Meet the Press, and various other national network news programs. He's written a book, Financial Shock, a 360-degree look at the subprime mortgage implosion and how to avoid the next financial crisis. It sounds like important reading for a lot of people. And then he has a forthcoming book, Paying the Price, which I hope is more positive than the title sounds. He has several degrees from the Wharton School down in Pennsylvania, and we're happy to have him with us today, so please join me in welcoming Mr. Zandi. Dr. Zandi.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and I want to thank Bob for organizing this and the business school, the law school for the opportunity to be here. It's very kind of you to give me a couple hours to speak. Appreciate that. I guess nothing worse than an economist for more than, how long would you like me to speak for?
Oh, take whatever time you want.
Yeah, right. Okay, sure.
Economists make assumptions.
Right,
you can
right.
assume.
What if I take 15, 20 minutes? Would that be okay? Sound
Yeah,
okay?
that
All right.
sounds like a
Okay,
reasonable
good.
assumption.
I'll make 3 points in my my remarks, and broadly what I'm going to do is consider the economic outlook through the prism of fiscal policy. So point number 1 is I think the fiscal policy performance with regard to the Great Recession, financial panic, the subsequent economic recovery, was pretty good. I think that what policymakers did ultimately was about as successful as one could expect, given the severity of what we faced and the political constraints that they had to make policy under. There was a whole range of fiscal policy responses to the Great Recession, the most notable being fiscal stimulus. And there's been several rounds of fiscal stimulus. In fact, if you total it all up, stimulus meaning temporary tax cuts and temporary spending increases, total $1.3 trillion. So the first form of fiscal stimulus was back in, it's hard to remember back, but summer of '08, we got tax rebate checks. Do you remember those rebate checks? The main stimulus, though, was the Recovery Act, and that was passed in early '09, February of '09. And I think that effort was key to ending the recession. The recession ended by June, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the official arbiters of when recessions begin and end. The job declines ended by February 2010, a year after the Recovery Act was passed. And now, not quite 2 years later, the economy's created just about 3 million private sector jobs. So not as much as I think many had hoped for, and certainly not enough to bring down unemployment in a meaningful way, but a success. The stimulus was never intended to be a source of long-term economic growth. It was intended to bring an end to the recession, jumpstart an economic recovery, and I think it did that. I think it was successful. So point number one is there's a lot of room for criticism. You know, if I were king for the day, I might have done things a little bit differently. But the totality of the policy response, the fiscal policy response, I think was quite good. It succeeded in pushing the economy forward. Point number two, the outlook for next year, 2012, is very dependent on what fiscal policymakers do in the next literally few days. That they have to make a big decision with respect to some additional fiscal stimulus. The two key things that they need to make a decision on are an extension, perhaps an expansion of the payroll tax holiday. As you know, we all got a 2% reduction in our payroll taxes in 2011. And by the way, just as a quick tangent, that was very helpful. The payroll tax cut for 2011 was worth about $110, $115 billion to American households. And that's roughly what we're going to spend on gasoline bills in 2011 over 2010. So because of the surge in energy prices and higher gasoline prices in 2011, we're going to spend collectively just about $110 billion more on gasoline in 2011 than in 2010. So very effectively, we took our tax cut and we put it right into our gasoline tank, which unfortunately didn't allow us to, it didn't provide any juice to the economy. You know, it wasn't a source of growth, but it was key to keeping the economy together as well as it was kept together. So I think the payroll tax holiday should be extended through 2012. You know, now it's a matter of judgment with respect to whether the economy can navigate through 2012 with a tax increase, an effective tax increase. If the 2% payroll holiday expires, it would be an effective tax increase of about $115, $120 billion. It's possible that it could make its way through. But I don't think it's appropriate to take that chance because if we do falter and go back into recession in 2012, the cost to us as taxpayers will be enormous. Tax revenues will fall. Spending will increase as more people become unemployed and go into unemployment insurance, need food stamps and other income support. And you know, ultimately the cost would be measurably greater. So, from that perspective, and from a perspective of buying a bit of insurance, I think it makes a lot of sense to extend that holiday. The other thing, policy step, stimulus provision that Congress and administration are debating and thinking about is emergency unemployment insurance, extending that program. That program, under current law, will also expire at the end of this year, and benefits for people who are unemployed for long periods of time will start to wind down, and by June of 2012 it'll be gone. There will be no additional monies. There are problems with emergency UI. I think there are incentive issues. There are folks that are taking advantage of the system, and we're getting because the program, emergency UI program, has been around for a couple of years now. We're getting some good studies of the impact on incentives, and looking at the studies, my sense is that the emergency UI program has probably added about 0.5 point to unemployment. So if you didn't have the emergency UI program, the unemployment rate, instead of being 8.5 to 9%, would be somewhere between 8 and 8.5%. So I think it's appropriate to acknowledge that there are these disincentive effects. But I do think the positives outweigh the negatives. That I do think for the vast majority of unemployed workers who are unemployed for long periods of time, they need this help. The statistic that seals that view in my mind is that for every open position, there are 4 to 5 unemployed workers. In a normal, well-functioning economy, it would be closer to 1 for 1. So most people who are unemployed for lengthy periods of time in the current economy are unemployed because they can't find work, and I think it is appropriate to help them. And I think it's good for the economy in the sense that the money, the income support they receive goes right into the economy very rapidly. It helps to support economic growth. So I think that would also be helpful. Just to give you a number, my estimate, if policymakers do nothing and the payroll tax holiday expires and the emergency UI program winds down, that'll cost the economy 8.9% of GDP in 2012. So just for context, the economy is going to grow 2% in 2011. So that's significant. And the hit will be most pronounced in the early part of 2012, Q1, Q2, when the economy is going to be at its most vulnerable. That's when the fallout from the European debt situation is going to be most significant, and when house price declines intensify as the foreclosure process begins to gear up again, which is a problem in many parts of the country. So I think, again, it's a matter of judgment, but it's my view that it would be appropriate, it would be good policy from a dollars and cents perspective, let alone from any other, that policymakers should extend the payroll tax holiday at the very least, and I would advocate also extending emergency UI. This brings me to point number 3. I said, how many points did I say I was going to make? Just checking you're paying attention. Point number 3, what fiscal policymakers do over the next year is also going to be very important to our long-term economic health. I think it's key that they reasonably follow through on current policy with respect to our long-term fiscal situation. Under current policy, I think if policymakers reasonably follow through on it, we will achieve what you might call fiscal sustainability. That is, under reasonable economic assumptions, budget deficits will narrow to the point where the nation's debt to GDP ratio will stabilize. That's sustainability. When I say that, I'm not arguing we're going to achieve fiscal sustainability for time immemorial, but over the next decade. After that, we've got other issues we need to grapple with respect to healthcare costs and entitlement costs, but at least over the next 10 years, what's in current law will get us there. In fact, one could argue that although the spectacle of raising the debt ceiling back in July and August was very painful and probably did a fair amount of damage to the economy near term, some good came out of that process. First and foremost, I think there's now general agreement with respect to what we need to do to achieve fiscal sustainability over the next 10 years. The Democrats and Republicans have largely agreed, and I think appropriately so, that we need about $4 trillion in 10-year deficit reduction, either reduced spending or increased tax revenue, to achieve that goal. I think that's roughly right. That's correct. So we have an agreement on the goal, and I think that's real progress. As part of the deal to raise the debt ceiling back in July and early August, policymakers agreed to a little less than $1 trillion in government spending cuts over the next 10 years. So out of the $4 trillion that we need, we got $1 trillion. They appointed a super committee to come up with another little over $1 trillion in 10-year deficit reduction. That process failed, but the backstop is that now we're going to have automatic spending cuts kick in 2013 and extend out for another 10 years, equal to a little over $1 trillion. So if policymakers stick to law, we now have $2 trillion in 10-year deficit reduction, a little over half of what we need to achieve our goal of $4 trillion. Moreover, under current law, the Bush tax cuts expire at the end of 2012. Everyone's tax rate is going to rise on January 1st, 2013, if policymakers do nothing. And by the way, if that were to happen, that raises a boatload of tax revenue, roughly $3.5 trillion over a 10-year period, more than you would need, right, to achieve fiscal sustainability. So I don't think that's going to happen, but there will need to be a piece of tax legislation sometime after the election, before January 1st, 2013. And I think at that point, we are going to get some tax reform, which means scaling back some of the deductions and credits in the tax code. Obviously, that would be very therapeutic for the economy long run, both corporate tax reform and reform to the personal income tax code. I think it's very hard to do politically, but if we can get some of that done, that would be very, very positive. And I think marginal rates probably will rise too for people that are in the perhaps top two brackets, and will generate the revenue that we need to achieve our goal of $4 trillion. So in my view, and I should say, it's certainly not the consensus view, that's much more pessimistic, I think that we're going to achieve fiscal sustainability. I think we've made a lot more progress than people think in addressing this problem in righting the wrong, and that'll become more evident after the election into 2013. And if I'm even 3/4 of the way right, I think that sets us up for a very surprisingly strong economy going forward. That there's a dark pessimism that has descended across America. You know, I have a lot of clients that are in the business community, and they're incredibly pessimistic. Clearly, folks in Washington are dark, and all of us are shell-shocked by what we've been through and what we're going through. And it's that pessimism is also descended on the economics community. There's a thinking that we're going to be stuck in a Japanese-like 2 decades of very weak growth, no growth, high unemployment, a period that's going to be very debilitating. I don't agree with that. I think we've made a lot of progress getting our collective balance sheets in order. Households have reduced debt. We still have more work to do. The foreclosure crisis isn't over. Businesses are in very good shape, at least in aggregate. Small companies aren't quite as strong as big companies, but in aggregate we're doing well. And the banking system is in good shape. Again, there's a distinction to be made between small banks and the big banks, but in general, the banking system's in good shape. So I think if we're able to, again, and this is where I'll end on a high note, that if fiscal policymakers, all they have to do is reasonably follow through on what is already on the books, we're going to set ourselves up, I think, for much stronger than expected growth over the coming decade. And if you invite me back 10 years from now, I will bet you, what's today's date? December 8th, is it 9th? 9th, 2011. Ask me back in December 9th, 2021, if I'm still around. Our problem then will not be high unemployment. It'll be we can't find enough workers. We can't find enough workers. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Dean Ennis mentioned that this is like a movie where you go through highs and lows. So Mark left you on a high. So I'm going to enter a little bit of the scary part now. Just for those of you that might be wanting to travel a little bit and see some of the darker challenges ahead. But I would reiterate that whatever problems that we have are quite solvable. And I thoroughly agree with Mark that if Congress and the President, our political leaders, reasonably follow through on what's on current law, the problems would not be as bad as many of us warn about. The catch there is reasonably following through. And what, from my perspective, one of the interesting things that's going on in Washington is that the deep as the economic problems are, the political problems seem to be worse. So it's our political dysfunction seems to be a deeper problem than our economic distress. And so the key question is, yes, these are solvable problems, and what's being tested now is the ability of our political system to deal with them. One can look at the options and say, there are plenty of reasonable options here. You can look at, for example, a plan like the Simpson-Bowles Commission report or the Rivlin-Domenici Commission report. Interest of full disclosure, I was on the Rivlin-Domenici Debt Reduction Task Force. But I think that we came up with some reasonable ideas for slowing the growth of debt, bringing it back to a reasonable and sustainable level of GDP. And they were ideas that Democrats and Republicans signed on to, and we can talk about specifics if you want to in the Q&A. But so there are reasonable options available. I thought what I would do is just go through some of the budget basics, budget deficits 101, scary budget deficits 101, and then we can talk about why how we can address those. Now, I don't know how to advance the slides, so let me see. Hey, there we go. Okay, Mark mentioned reasonably following through on what's in current law, and that is absolutely true. This is two scenarios of the next 10 years in terms of the budget deficit, and the one that looks more optimistic, the blue line, shows deficits leveling off somewhere around a less than $500 billion. That is the so-called current law baseline. What that means is what would happen if Congress just did nothing and let current law take effect. Now, that would mean that the tax cuts would expire. It would mean that we'd collect a whole lot more money from the alternative minimum tax. Most of the changes are on the revenue side. Medicare doctors would get cut by about 30% because that's embedded in current law as well. But the net effect would be a much more sustainable budget outlook, which deficits would be around 1.5% or less of GDP under that scenario. The other scenario that shows deficits creeping up around over $1.5 trillion by the end of the decade and never getting below $1 trillion. This is sort of the $1 trillion decade for as far as the eye can see. That assumes a current policy approach where a lot of the policies, including the tax cuts that we have embedded in current law, are extended, and that makes the budget outlook considerably more challenging. This just shows what some of the changes are. As you can see, most of them are on the tax side, and this includes a drawdown of some war expenses. So we do have a very, very big policy decision to make with regard to the expiration of the tax cuts and what we do about AMT reform. And the key point, though, is if you want to try to follow the current law baseline, that blue baseline, that doesn't mean that you have to literally interpret every policy of current law. I mean, you might not want all the tax cuts to expire, but maybe you want to collect that revenue in a different form. And that's where you get into, can you engage in some sort of tax reform that makes the code, broadens the base and lowers rates and actually brings in more revenue. So, to try to achieve what's assumed in current law doesn't mean you necessarily have to stick with all of the policies there. It means you have to come up with something that achieves the same result. Now, spending and deficits as a percentage of the economy is very important to get a handle on this because it's really, you hear numbers being thrown about all the time, trillions, billions, gazillions. It's important to compare that to some sort of standard. For example, $1 million mortgage, picture $1 million mortgage. For Bill Gates, that would mean nothing. For me, it would mean quite a bit. It would be rather foolish for me. So you have to compare how much the government is spending, how much taxes are being raised by some sort of standard. So our national economy is the way that most economists like to look at that. And what this is showing is that in general, we have the federal government has tended to spend at about 21% of GDP and tax around 18.5% of GDP, meaning that we tend to run deficits at about 2.5% of GDP. And if your economy is growing by about that much, 2.5 or 3%, then you have a sustainable situation. It's when your budget deficits are growing faster than your economy that you begin to increase your debt to GDP ratio, and that, if it's growing fast enough, is ultimately going to become an unsustainable problem. The problem that we have now is that traditional set points that we've had on revenue and spending are changing. We aren't looking at a future where spending is going to trend at around 21% of GDP and revenues at 18.5% of GDP. And so there's an underlying structural budget deficit that transcends the budget deficits that we're seeing right now that are caused by the recession and the attempts to deal with that. So it's not just a economic cyclical problem we have. There's an underlying structural deficit between the spending plans that we have in place and the revenue system that we have in place. The revenue doesn't cover the spending on even in a full employment economy, and that's why we've got a budget structural deficit that has to be addressed. Now, this shows you why what I just said is true about where the old numbers of 18.5 and 21% might not hold. It also shows you why there's such a political problem in dealing with this. In the future, and it's beginning to happen already with my generation beginning to qualify for Social Security and Medicare as we do. 3 programs in the budget, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which are about 40% of the total federal spending right now, are going to grow, projected to grow under current law, assuming no changes are made, by about 5 to 6% of the economy over the next 20 years or so, 20, 25 years. That's an awful lot. Thinking about adding 5 to 6% of GDP to the federal budget is an awful lot. Think of it this way. The Pentagon, the defense budget, is about 4.5 to 5% of GDP. So the growth alone in these 3 programs is going to be like adding a new Pentagon, doubling the defense budget. Or if you want to look at it another way, it's, individual income taxes are around 6% of GDP. So you could look at that and say it's somewhere around close to doubling income taxes in order to pay for the growth of these three programs alone. So by contrast, all other federal programs are projected to shrink over that time. And if we don't do anything to modulate the budget deficits, to keep the budget deficits under control in the interim, it's actually the interest costs that grow even more than the entitlement programs, because we're running so much debt and having to pay interest on that debt that it's actually the interest costs that really kill you before you get to this point. I mean, it's like one thing is going to kill you, but the other thing is going to kill you faster if you don't do anything about it. So that's why it's important to get a hold of the budget deficits as soon as we can, with due regard to the fragile state of the economy. Why is this happening? Well, it's not just like Congress is on a bender and spending like drunken sailors and all like that. When you look at the projected growth, it's basically because there are going to be a heck of a lot more beneficiaries for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And healthcare costs are growing faster than the economy. They have traditionally for the past many years. And you put those two factors together, and you can see why federal spending is going to be a lot higher in the future just for those three programs. And so what do you do about it? You have only a few choices. One is you can control the growth of those spending, try to get into entitlement reform, and that's what puts Medicare and Social Security reform high on the agenda. The other thing you can do is raise taxes to pay for it, but that would require a very large tax increase far above what Americans are used to paying or seem to want to pay. And the other thing you could do is cut the heck out of the rest of the budget. Which is the path that we seem to be following right now, because politically it's very difficult to tackle the entitlement problems. It's very difficult to raise taxes, so what do you fall back on? Cut the heck out of everything else in the budget. And that is this trigger that's going into effect because the supercommittee fails. Nothing that has been done so far, and I agree with Mark, there has been substantial progress on caps on discretionary spending. It's not like Congress has done nothing, but they haven't gotten to where the real money is and the real choices are, the entitlement programs and the revenue side. And that will happen again with the triggers. Most of the cuts, if they're allowed to go into effect, are again hitting discretionary spending. But there's only so far you can get with that, before you run out of room, because you can't just eliminate the Pentagon. You can't just eliminate everything we do on the defense, on the non-defense discretionary side. That's where the federal investments come in our economy. If you're talking about transportation or education, anything that the federal government is going to spend money on, and there's a lot of waste. We all concede there's a lot of waste, but there's a lot of good stuff too. And so if the federal government is going to play any constructive role, it's going to be tougher and tougher, no matter what your interest is in doing that. I'm going to just close with that reiteration that I think what has to happen going forward in the wake of the defeat of the, not the defeat of the supercommittee, but the self-inflicted defeat, the failure of the supercommittee, is for next year or whenever we get around to this, whether it's this year, going to be hard to do in an election year, no doubt about that. But clearly by 2013, there's going to be another run up this legislative hill. And whenever they do it, they're going to have to look at health care. They're going to have to look at Social Security. They're going to have to look at revenues. And one of the things that they can look at on revenues is to look at this so-called tax expenditures. Mark alluded to this too. There's a lot of stuff that we do through the tax code that's basically spending. And it's tax breaks, exclusions, deductions, credits, things that make the tax code much less efficient than it should be, and drain revenues. And it's just fascinating when you look at the two things about tax expenditures. Most of them affect individuals and not corporations, so we can talk about corporate jets and that sort of thing. But most of them are things like the home mortgage interest deduction or exclusion of employer-provided health insurance, things that people like. They're entitlement programs. They're run through the tax code. And the other thing is that we drain almost as much revenue through these things as we collect in revenues from the existing code. So I think there's a lot that can be done. It's a matter of having the political courage to do it. I'll end with this, that I've spent a lot of time on the road with people from right-wing think tanks and left-wing think tanks and centrist budget people. And I've always found that there's a consensus around a few basic points. One is that the fiscal situation that we have right now is unsustainable. We can't keep doing what we're doing. Nobody would lend us the money. The debt would get too big and swamp the economy. Second is that there really are no easy solutions here. Everybody wants to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. Everybody wants to grow the economy. We should do those things. That's part of the solution. But it's not the only part of the solution. And if we kid ourselves that that's the solution, then we're not going to be able to find those reasonable conclusions that Mark was mentioning. The other thing is we're going to have bipartisan cooperation. There's not a whole lot of that in Washington these days. I am hopeful, though, that enough people are seeing signs of catastrophe and looking at what's going on in Europe and saying, let's not let that happen here. Let's learn a lesson from that. And there are people that are working together. There's the Bowles-Simpson group. There's the so-called Gang of Six in the Senate. And I can say that I've been talking to Senator Shaheen about doing a budget forum with Senator Johnny Isakson, a Republican from Georgia. And they've said that they would be interested in doing that and doing a home-and-home, one here in New Hampshire and one in Georgia. We're finding a lot of, Senators Warner and Chambliss work together. We're finding a lot of sort of, the beginnings of some bipartisan cooperation that I think it's important to try to pick up on. Because neither party can do this on their own, frankly. They don't have the votes to shove through their own agenda, so we might as well get to try to making these compromises. I think public engagement is terribly important. I think the super committee did not do a good job of engaging the public. They held their meetings in private. They didn't even engage their own fellow members of Congress. So I think it's important for members to get out on the road and engage the public as part of the debate. And finally, I think it's important that while we talk a lot about numbers, basically this is not a numbers thing. I mean, it's basically about, it's a moral issue about the vision that you see for the nation. And if the vision that you see under current law, this is like, as a seasonal illusion, the ghost of Christmas future. If what you're seeing is this very Scrooge-like future, then and you're content with that, then what does that say? I mean, about us, that we're not willing to make some basic choices to provide a better future for our children and grandchildren. So look, I end with an optimistic note too. If Ebenezer Scrooge could do it, so can we. Yeah. So we're happy to take your questions.
Hi, I'm Mitch Simon. I'm one of the teachers here, which means that I have expertise in calling on people when they put their hands up. And so my job is going to be to do that. I was really optimistic when I heard Mark's presentation, thinking that a shortage of workers means my 27-year-old will finally have to get a job. And then Bill got me back to reality, I'm afraid. So what we'd like to do simply is just open it up for questions for either or both of them. So please, sir.
So I'm curious. Mark, I mean, your projections of being in good shape for the next 20 years. I mean, have we looked at the population? I mean, we're sort of facing a rough future because the baby boomer generation is getting to where they're going to be entitled to all these Medicare, Social Security, all that. What's the next generation look like? I mean, because 20 years from now, all due respect to the baby boomer generation folks here, I mean, they're going to have either died off or be pretty darn close. What's the next generation? And by the way, they're all going
about
to.
That.
No, we're never going to leave. That's where you're wrong.
They're going to have died off, and all of their wealth is going to have gotten flushed through the economy. to the next generation, of which perhaps, it's a smaller number, so that it really isn't as big a problem. I mean, certainly we're facing a problem, right? But maybe it's not quite as bad because, 20 years from now,
Well, I'd
something's
say,
going to have changed.
yeah, maybe I'll respond in two ways. I mean, first, just a statistic, the largest single-year age group in the country, there are more of these folks than any other age, is 52. There are more 52-year-olds than any other age group. And there's a boatload, that's the teeth of the boomer generation. Right. So they'll be around in 20 years. Yeah, okay, yeah. And by the way, I am 52. I am 52, yeah. I represent the largest single-year age group. And I'm running every day, buddy. So, there's a boatload of 53-year-olds, 54-year-olds, 51-year-olds. The second largest single-year age group, after that bulge. You want to guess?
It's not giving me.
It's 22. My firstborn. Yeah, right. And that group is almost as large as that 50-year-old group. So there is, a period where you get much slower population growth because of the aging of the boomers, and that the teeth of the baby boom echo generation isn't quite there. So that's one point. But there is, pretty large bulge that now are in their 20s. They're going to be approaching their 30s over the next 10, and then their 40s when they're in their prime, most productive years. Second point, though, is that because you do have this kind of lull, it would be a positive for the economy, I think, if we figured out a way to reform our immigration system to allow for more immigrants that are highly educated and skilled. So, for example, if I were, I was going to say king for the day, but I need a week for this. King for the week, I'd say anybody who came to the United States from a foreign country, earned a degree in an accredited American university or community college, would get a visa. I'd stamp it right on their head. That kind of thing. And I think ultimately that's where we're going to go, because I do think 10 years from now we are going to have a labor shortage. You can already feel it in the highly skilled areas of the economy. There is a developing labor shortage. And it's going to become very prevalent over the next few years, and 10 years from now it's going to be screamingly loud. And I think we will change our immigration laws. But that would be very helpful in addressing the issues that you've brought up. But we do have, we're going to be around for a while, and our kids are coming fast. So
I would just add that I'm a couple of years older than Mark, but continue to ride a life cycle every day. I gave up jogging, so
yeah, you look like you're in great shape.
We'll be around for a while yet. But the two things, the budget projections, you take that into account. I mean, they do look at demographic trends. For example, the Social Security Administration, when they do the Medicare and Social Security projections, do a lot of study of the demographics and how that will affect and play out over 75 years. They have to make assumptions that may or may not hold true. And the other thing is, but it does make a difference because there are a couple things going on. You do see this run up over the next 20 years or so in Social Security and Medicare costs, and that is directly related to the number of new beneficiaries. But beyond that, you do see a leveling off, particularly with Social Security, where the number of, it just sort of settles off at a higher level as a percentage of our economy. And so the longer out you look, the more that healthcare cost becomes important, because some of the really scary numbers come from failing to get a hold of rising healthcare costs, and the fact that it's not just the boomers, but everybody is living longer. I mean, that's a good thing. As President Clinton used to say, that's a high-class problem. But we're going to have to accommodate that increased cost somehow.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Mark, I want to catch you on that one point. If you talk about the labor shortage, one of my concerns is what appears to me to be a beating down of public education, and where does that leave us with the educated workforce we need in going forward?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. To address our labor market issues and our fiscal issues, I think immigration policy is key. But also key is the resources we devote to educating and training our workforce. We're really giving short shrift to that, and that's, in my view, a very significant error. We do need to make some hard choices with respect to what we're going to spend our resources on, particularly in the context of wanting to be very careful about tax rates and tax revenue. But I would put at the very top of the priority list, investment in our human capital, because that reaps enormous benefit. And most importantly of all, the thing that makes our economy tick, our comparative advantage in the global economy, is our highly skilled workforce. That's how we compete. And if we don't have a skilled and educated workforce, we won't compete. Our economy will be diminished, and our budgetary problems will be measurably more significant. So, I think that's very important. And, there are a lot of things that we can do. One thing that I think would be very helpful and effective, both near and long term, with respect to the educational system, is investing in our community colleges. That they're in every community across the country. They can reach into parts of the country where we have pockets of underemployed workers and underemployed workers who can't move because they're underwater or just don't know where to move, don't have, and are unable to, and they can get the training and education through the community college system. So I think that we need to focus on that. Now, one other final thing I'd say is that we need to be creative about this. That given our limited collective resources, the budgetary pressures, I think there are ways to get the private sector more involved. So, for example, there are very interesting efforts by some large companies to help fund universities, community colleges, the quid pro quo, and that's for everything from laboratories to paying faculty. The quid pro quo is they have input into the curriculum process, right? So they can help, and I know there's all kinds of issues with respect to freedom of thought and intellectual freedom, but this is a way to get the private sector engaged and involved in providing money to help fund this education and retraining that we need to be competitive long run. So we have to think about this in a more creative way. We can't just rely on the old system of, we devote some share of the budget to education and retraining, and we keep it that way, because it's just not going to work given our budgetary constraints.
Bill, did you want to react to that?
No.
Go back there, David, and then I'll come forward here.
With regard to the possible end of the Bush-era tax cuts starting 2013, first of all, I'd like to challenge your optimism that we're going to get past that deadline and have accomplished something, because we're going to be spending the next year in an election and inaugurating either a new president or the one that we have right now. And the gridlock is worse now than it's ever been. So the idea that they could necessarily get a hold of something as significant as that when they're having trouble getting a hold of something like the payroll tax holiday is, I think, overly optimistic. My question to you is, what is the effect of doing nothing with regard to the end of the Bush-era tax cuts? You mentioned what it does in terms of the structure, in terms of the deficit, in terms of it being an increase in the tax revenue. What does it do on the fiscal side of things and the economics of the rest of the economy aside from government revenue?
Well, do you want to?
I think
respond?
that's.
Yeah. Okay. I was
I'm
hoping
giving
you
you the revenue number.
Right. Well, it's the gridlock that makes me optimistic that we're going to generate tax revenue, because under current law, tax rates rise. You're going to need a piece of tax legislation to change that. So the gridlock is the reason for optimism. Now, my sense is that after the election, before the Bush tax cuts expire, that there will actually be a piece of tax legislation, because I don't think there's any appetite, Democrat or Republican, to allow everyone's tax rates to rise from top to bottom.
We're not even going to be inaugurating that Congress until those tax cuts expire.
You have a lame duck session. They do lots of things in lame duck sessions. right? They have to do something because on January, now you could construct a scenario where, let's say, the Democrats get completely wiped out. What I mean by that is the House is Republican, the President is Republican, the Senate is Republican by more than 60 seats. You probably need 62, 63 seats. Then that's bulletproof, right? And so you could get on the other side of the election and the Republicans could take back whatever they wanted. They could roll back those tax cuts. But even in that scenario, which is very unlikely, you could construct it, but it's very unlikely. I'm not sure that would happen. I mean, if I were the Republican president, I'm saying, listen, I can blame the Democrats for raising taxes, and now I have fiscal sustainability. Maybe I roll back some of it, but I won't roll back all of it. So I don't know that that's the right scenario. In fact, I can remember back when the Bush tax cuts were first implemented back in 2001, and the debate was, will we ever let those tax cuts expire? Will we ever? And you know what? There was a reasonable argument that we ultimately would have to, and we would, just because of the budgetary pressures and because of the politics of it. And I think that the odds are very high that that's what's going to happen.
I want to reiterate that the default mechanism is that they expire. So a piece of legislation needs to be written and passed and signed into law by the president. So whether people want taxes on the table or not, they are on the table because by operation of law. And that may drive negotiations at some point. So I mean, it is an action-forcing event whenever it takes place.
Thank you. Sir?
My interests are in energy. I'm interested that neither of you mentioned that. Here in the Northeast, we're incredibly dependent on petroleum products. 80% of our residents, 65% of our commercial are using that. 7% of the state's GDP, $6 billion, goes out of state within 2 weeks on petroleum purchases. And we're seeing a 45% increase in oil costs from last winter to this winter in just 1 year. With climate change accelerating at a much faster rate than even the most pessimistic models indicated, total gridlock, internationally on what to do about it, and increasing volatility in the Middle East, we're seeing real crazy volatility in oil prices, and we're seeing catastrophic environmental impacts from droughts to fires to, this snowstorm we had a couple of weeks ago where, they're trying to blame the snowstorm on the utility, it's kind
Wasn't their fault?
Yeah, it's clearly their fault. So we're going to have 300 yards on either side of every transmission line,
Who are you?
Clear. Who am I?
Yeah.
I run a nonprofit called the Jordan Institute.
Okay.
Okay. And my name's Dick Henry.
Good to meet you.
So I see a lot of dislocation and this sort of assumption of the business as usual, even in the bad scenarios you're putting forward. Where do you see this migration from a petroleum-based economy to a something else-based economy fitting into what you see in the next 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, really good question. Let me give you the mechanical answer, and then I'll try to provide a little color around it. I mean, in my sort of outlook, I essentially assume that the cost of energy, broadly defined, rises at the rate of inflation. That's roughly what it is. It goes up and down and all around, and is, as you say, very volatile, but it rises at the rate of inflation. I sense that certainly in the near term, meaning over the next 5-10 years, that's likely an optimistic scenario, that energy markets are very supply constrained, and demand is very dependent on growth in the emerging world. And on average, the emerging world is going to grow quickly. It's very energy intensive. That bumps up against the supply constraints, and so you're going to get prices rising more quickly than probably the overall rate of inflation. It also creates, that's why you get all this volatility, right? Because of the supply side of the market is constrained, and you got demand moving up and down around that supply. So I sympathize with your concern in I think that's a big, it's a very important reason why we should be focused like a laser beam on energy policy. I will say, though, that so I think it is appropriate to be negatively predisposed to the energy outlook, that this is an area we need to really focus on. But having said that, there are reasons that are possible that this thing turns out better than anticipated. That energy markets are, like most markets, are pretty miraculous things. When prices rise, you find supply through new deposits or new technology, and we're finding them here in the United States. So the natural gas resources that we have are enormous, and we didn't even know that 3 years ago. And my sense is that we'll figure out a way, given the price differentials between oil and natural gas, to bring that into our transportation network. Right now, our transportation network is the biggest consumer of petroleum, oil, and if we can get the natural gas into the transportation network, that'll be quite significant in terms of bringing, helping with respect to our economic growth. And I think that's going to happen. And moreover, when you're in a world of higher prices and expectations for further price increases, people will invest in new technology, both in terms of traditional petroleum-based technologies, but new renewable energy as well. So I don't know what what those technologies will bring and how successful they will be. But the one thing I do know, looking back historically, we always get bailed out by technology, especially when prices are high. It brings in a lot of resources. So, this may in fact work out better than anticipated.
I would just say.
Why don't we take it offline?
Okay,
because
take it offline.
yeah.
Let me try to get a few more questions in. I want to say to our guests, the people leaving are in no way on the quality of the discussion. But
how do you know that? You have no idea.
Oh, you're in class. When they come in late, and we built a room that comes straightforward. So, Harold?
Question for Bob. Your chart on interest rates, I've seen it before, and it's stunning and it's scary. It goes parabolic. Could you talk a little further about that? Right now, with monetary stimulus, interest rates are practically zero, so the costs of the accumulating deficit so far haven't really hit the budget.
Yeah, I mean,
at some point they will.
One of the things that we're able to do right now, the federal government is able to do, is borrow huge sums of money at very, very low cost. And so you look at the interest cost to the federal government, and they're actually a lot lower than you might think, given the amount of borrowing that's been going on. If you look at the projections, the difficulty is that when interest rates return to somewhat a more normal level, which we would hope that they would do with an economic recovery, the cost of rolling over that debt is going to be much more expensive. And if we're continuing to borrow at large sums to finance the government, then our interest costs quickly metastasize, sort of like anybody that tries to live off their credit cards and makes the minimum payment. So that the projections on interest cost, are that they go up, depending upon what your assumption is about the budget trajectory, $600 billion to $1 trillion a year. In our scenario, sort of our the worst looking line that I showed up there, interest costs get to $1 trillion, but within 10 years, which is more than we'd be spending on defense. And as a percentage of our economy, as our percentage of revenues, interest costs quickly grow to a problematic level, and that is something that it assumes that we don't have a spike in interest rates. I mean, right now interest rates are very, very low. But when they go back to quote unquote more normal levels, if we don't have our fiscal house in order, there may be some sort of a risk premium added on. So I think it's something to watch, and it's one reason why what is happening now economically and fiscally is so difficult of a calculation, because you don't want to do things, you don't want to slam on the brakes in this sort of an economy. And yet, what you don't want to continue the buildup in policies that are going to be unsustainable over the longer term, including running up these interest costs. So, ideally, this idea of can Congress walk and chew gum at the same time economically is, can you do things that will aid the economy in the short term, like extending the unemployment compensation or extending the payroll tax, and take actions that will address the long-term structural deficit at the same time. That's what ideally, that's what they should be able to do. That's not a contradictory proposition. It can get confusing to people. But, you don't have to look at deficit reduction and economic, for lack of a better word, stimulus, because nobody likes it these days, that's not a contradiction. I mean, you should be able to design policies that would be accommodating to the economy in the short term while reining in the longer-term structural problem. And that's what we tried to do in the Rivlin-Domenici recommendations and the Simpson-Bowles recommendations. That debate, I still think that would be the best thing to do, because it would kind of address all the problems. Congress just is not ready to have that debate right now.
You could describe it as the mother of all adjustable rate mortgages. People might understand.
Yeah, you could. And in fact, I think I have described it that way.
But that chart assumes a certain interest rate. It's not zero.
No, that assumes a growth. That assumes that they grow back to a normal rate. Yeah.
Apologize, I've had my back to folks on this side, so let me go back there, sir.
Suggestion and a couple questions. To broaden the audience for this, I wonder if you could consider getting CDs or DVDs out to the public access television stations in the communities. People tend to, for whatever God only knows, watch those with great regularity, and that they're looking for programming, and you could repeat this stuff so that they begin to get it. And it's a good forum. 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, I just throw this out, and it's free. And they are looking for, they have a lot of space on televisions locally, and at least to begin to stimulate some discussion. This is thoughtful. Questions. We have an aging population, aging demographic, the households are over indebted compared to where they were in the 90s. And if we have approximately 70% of the GDP is consumer driven, and we have people being encouraged to buy stuff who are already deficient in savings, and we have a tax code that encourages debt and discourages saving, how do we pull this together so it becomes sustainable, and that you have this generation and the next one being encouraged to save as opposed to floating debt, which we've reached the logical absurdity of the debt incentives now, and it's imploding. Just a question as part of it, the sustainability of the growth. I throw it out, just either one of you.
Well, I'll sort of take the non-economist, and then you can listen to the economist on it. But I've always thought that, one of the reasons to be worried about deficit reduction is the effect on national savings, and that we don't, the net national savings is very important to growing the economy in the future. And to the extent that the federal government is running enormous budget deficits, it detracts from national savings. And when consumers aren't, Americans have not been saving very much in recent decades, then that drives down the national savings rate. We have to import capital from abroad to help finance our way of life, and the problem with that is simply that the benefit from that investment would flow back overseas rather than stay here at home. So it acts as a mortgage on our future national income. So I think one of the economic reasons to be worried about deficits, and that it's not just a green eyeshade issue, is the effect that it has on long-term, has on our prospects for economic growth. Short term, you might say a deficit can help the economy, but you can't do it over the long term. You're detracting from economic growth, and that, so you got a double whammy on future generations, which is the interest burden, the debt burden, plus investing less in the economy that's going to have to sustain them.
I'd just say two things. One is the debt load of households has declined quite sharply in the last 3-4 years. In terms of the share of income, our income that goes to servicing debt, it's pretty close to a record low, falling quickly. Now, you got to make a distinction between. There's really two households out there: one, sort of lower middle income households and middle higher income. Middle higher income, if they've got any debt at all, it's a fixed rate mortgage at 4%, 5%. And lower income households who are still struggling with their mortgages and foreclosure. But in aggregate, the household, the American household, is in much, much better shape than they were a number of years ago, and it continues to improve. And you can see it in the credit statistics. I mean, credit card delinquency rates are as low as they've ever been. Auto loan delinquency rates, consumer finance delinquency rates. So we've made a lot of progress. More work to be done, to be sure, but we've made a lot of progress there. So I think U.S. households and consumers are on better footing, and they can do their part to ensure that our economy moves forward. But that going to my second point, we can't count on the American consumer to lead the way. The American consumer took on a lot of debt, reduced saving in the last 25 years up and through to the teeth of the bubble in the housing market in the mid part of the last decade. So the American consumer drove economic growth here in the U.S. and globally, China and the rest of the world. We're not going to be able to do that going forward. So we do need another source of growth, and that is selling what we produce to consumers in the rest of the world. And that's why we need an educated and trained workforce, because that's our comparative advantage. That's how we compete, and we need to be able to have products and services that we can sell to the rest of the world. And just to give some granularity to that statement, we're going to export things that we do well and have always done well: aircraft, agricultural products, machine tools, sophisticated instruments, pharmaceuticals. But we're going to do things, we're going to export services that we do fabulously well. No one else does them except maybe the British, and they employ a lot of people. Architectural services, accounting services, legal services, media, entertainment, advertising, management consulting services, economic consulting services. I'm not kidding. I employ 125 people in my little world in suburban Philadelphia, and those folks, many of them are building models that the European banks are using now in their stress testing process. That is an export, and the folks that are doing that work are the best and the brightest on the planet, and they get paid fabulously well. So, but that goes back to the immigration law. I, for example, wanted to bring in one of the best econometricians in the world. He's from the Czech Republic, to work in Westchester, PA, my hometown. That's where I grew up. And I couldn't do it because of visa legal issues. And if it was still my company, I would have brought him in and I would have fought the legal issues. But I'm part of the Moody's Corporation, and as you can imagine, they're quite sensitive to legal concerns. So they said no. But they are a multinational that's got operations all over the planet. So they said, okay, well, you just set up an office in Prague. So now I have this fella and 10 other people in my Prague office, right? Which is a travesty, right? Because if I had brought that guy to Westchester, PA, I assure you in 2-3 years he's going to be saying that Zandy's an idiot. I know things better than he does, and he's going to go start his own company and employ another 50, 100 people, right? So a huge error on our part. But that's where we're going to. U.S. consumers are going to do their part, but no more. And we're going to pick up the slack by selling what we do well to the rest of the world.
We have time for one more. Chelsea? Yes. No, right behind you, sorry.
Me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm wanting to know, you're talking a lot about the federal issues that, hey, if Congress keeps up with what they're doing, our federal economy, our national economy is going to be looking good. But a lot of complaints are coming from the states that what Congress is doing is hurting them individually and providing further dings to their economy. So while our national economy in this big picture is doing all right, in these next 10 years, what's going to be happening with states as they're seeing cuts from federal spending that they've come to depend on?
Would you like me to take that, Bob? Or you want to
both take it?
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that the condition of the state budgets is, quite problematic. I think it's, maybe coming back a little bit, but the states have a problem that the federal government has as well, maybe even more serious, on pension and health care costs that, for promises made long ago, that are now beginning to crop up, and they're beginning to look at costs in the future. And so that's, one of the biggest problems for states is this, again, like the federal budget, structural overpromises. They have less flexibility than the federal government. Most have balanced budget requirements. And so when you have hard times, you need to do things like cut spending and raise taxes, which makes it all the more difficult. So I think that if the state budgets are looking for help from Washington, they will be disappointed, because the problems at the federal level will affect the state budgets negatively. You're already looking at Medicaid reform. One of the ideas the state is a program that's shared by state and federal governments, is sending some of the money back, sending some of the responsibilities back to the states without necessarily the money to go with it. And I know a lot of state governors are very concerned about that sort of thing, the sort of devolution without resources. So I think state budgets are going to be facing quite a bit of difficulty for a while. I just wanted to, on a slightly different point, I wasn't saying, and I don't know that Mark was saying, that if Congress continues to do what they're doing, they'll be okay. What is true is if they follow current law, the question is, will they do that? What they're doing at the moment doesn't fill me with any confidence.
But I mean, if that current law, though, that's
if they did nothing.
Yeah, but that's exactly what's harming the states, as far as part of their budget, because they depend on the federal promises to then turn around and make their promises to various entitlement recipients or whatever.
No, I mean the current because the current law doesn't really it contemplates a tax increase because of the expiration of the tax cuts, cuts to Medicare and that sort of thing. But it would probably actually be a better scenario for state budgets than what they might likely do otherwise. But Mark, do you have any?
I mean, if your focus is the near term, not these unfunded liabilities that states have issues with that are going to be serious problems somewhere down the road, but if we're focused on the next few years, 4, 3, 5, 7 years, I think state governments in aggregate are in pretty good shape. That tax revenues are now rising year over year, high single digit. They've done a very good job of cutting their cost structures. They've reduced employment. They've reduced programs. Their budgets are, in aggregate, close to balance. This is at the state level. So I think the problems for the states are behind us in the near term, the next 3, 5, 7 years. That's not the case for local government, however, because local government in most parts of the country are tied right to house prices and commercial real estate property prices, and they're still falling. And for the first time on record, and we have data back to World War II, property tax revenue is falling. There was one quarter after Proposition 13 in California where they declined, but abstracting from that. So local government is under tremendous pressure, but its fortunes are, and they're now working really hard to get their cost structures in line. We're losing 15, 20K in local government employees every month, and total local government employment is now down almost 500,000 from the peak 3 years ago. So local governments are really working to get their cost structures down. So the key here is getting stability in the housing market, commercial property market, and get house prices moving north again as opposed to south. And I think and I expect that to happen, not next 6, 12 months, but by this time next year, I expect that to happen, then the pressure on local governments will abate as well. So my view is that state and local governments have been under tremendous pressure, but we're past the worst of it. In this next 3, 5, 7 years, yes, we've got tremendous issues longer run with pension benefits and what's happening with the Medicaid system and other obligations the state's been asked to take on. But next 3, 5, 7 years, we're pretty close to, we're past the worst of it, and if everything hangs together reasonably well, I think we'll be in pretty good shape a year from now.
Thanks. On behalf of the Whittemore School, UNH Law, Concord Coalition, Business and Industry Association, who are the sponsors of today, let me thank all of you for coming. And most importantly, let me thank our two guests. I have to say, I haven't spent an hour and 15 minutes and learned as much in an awfully long time. And there was an awful lot of light coming out. And when you watch television news and others, it's awfully difficult. So I'm thrilled that you guys were both able to come up here, and hopefully they'll have a few minutes to talk with people, and you'll get a chance to visit. And thank you to all of our guests. So come back again.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Hey, thank you.